Ahlan. My name is Livia Wick. I'm an anthropologist here at AUB, and I'm very happy to be here. I will be moderating this session. I have three distinguished speakers to present. The first is Mariam Al-Ali. She actually was my student as an undergraduate. I'm very proud. She received a PhD in Arabic language and literature from the Department of Arabic and Near Eastern Languages here at the American University of Beirut. She received it last year. She didn't. She was selected for the Abdel Hadi Dibbs Endowment Excellence Award, which is given to graduate students with outstanding academic record who have demonstrated research capabilities through a thesis deemed by the faculty worthy of publication. Her PhD thesis entitled "The Images of Khadija al-Kubra, the First Wife of the Prophet of Islam Across the Centuries," which was supervised by Tarif al-Khalidi, is forthcoming as a publication in 2019. She recently published an article in the journal Alif, and I'm very happy to listen to her talk now. تفضلي.
Thank you, Dr. Wick. أجدد الشكر على دعوتي للمشاركة في هذا المؤتمر، ولعلي كنت أوفر الطلاب حظاً في تاريخ دائرة اللغة العربية بالجامعة الأمريكية في بيروت على الإطلاق، إذ أشرف على أطروحتي للدكتوراه ذي طريف خالدي. لما كانوا يسألوني مع مين بدك تشتغلي؟ قل لهم مع طريف خالدي. يقولوا لي ذي طريف خالدي؟ قل لهم أنا إيه. بعد إلحاحي الطفولي قبل الدكتور طريف أن يبتلى بمشروع بحثي لأكثر من 3 سنوات، كان خلالها أعطف أستاذ عرفته في حياتي، بدليل أنه امتنع عن التدخين تماماً في جلسات نقاشنا الطويلة عندما كنت حاملاً بابنتي في السنة الأخيرة من عملي على الأطروحة. حتى ابنتي ذات العامين مدينة له بشيء من ذكائها، لأنها كانت تتشرب معي وقبل أن تولد أفكاره وأسئلته المحفزة دوماً على البحث والتفكير. فشكراً دكتور خالدي. سأستطلع في هذا العرض الموجز خبر سبب قتل علي بن أبي طالب كما يرويه الطبري في تاريخه، مبرزة فيه أوجهاً من الجمالية النصية أو الشعرية التي تتسلل إلى تسريد خبر سبب القتل. والشعرية المقصودة هنا هي تلك الميزة التي تخلفها بنى وأدوات ونظم تمكن نص الخبر من أن يخلف تأثيرات معينة على المتلقي. سأبين أن ما يمهد لهذه الشعرية هو أولاً الحديث في متن الخبر عن الحب الذي جمع عبد الرحمن بن ملجم قاتل علي وامرأة تدعى قطامي، وثانياً من خلال الأبيات المنظومة التي تبدل الكلام من النثر إلى الشعر في آخر الخبر. على ضوء تحليل هذا المتن والشعر الملحق به، وبتتبع تنويعات أخرى للخبر في سياقات نصية مختلفة سوى سياق التاريخ، سنبرهن كيف تعزز الشعرية عملية هذا الخبر، أي فعاليته الأخلاقية التي تحوله من نص يروي جزءاً من ماضٍ تاريخي إسلامي historical past إلى نص إرشادي يكتنف ماضياً عملياً practical past، يعين متلقيه على الإجابة عن سؤال ماذا نفعل الآن وهنا. نستعير هذه التفرقة بين الماضي التاريخي والماضي العملي بصفتهما نوعين مفهوميين مختلفين من محاولة هايدن وايت التنظيرية للعلاقة بين النوعين، التي بسط فيها موقفه النقدي من دراسة التاريخ في الغرب. فهذه الدراسة بدأت تتجرد برأيه من أي فائدة عملية بحلول القرن ال19. تحول التاريخ إذاك إلى علم له طرائق محددة وحدها فقط تجيز للمتلقي أن يعتقد بصحة وقائع تاريخية معينة حدثت في جزء من الماضي، لكنها تقصر عن أن ترشده في مواقفه التي يعيشها في حاضره، أو أن تحل مشاكله العملية الراهنة. وهذا تحول عما يفترض بالكتابة التاريخية أن تؤديه، أي تقديم العبر والنماذج السلوكية للأفراد، كما كان الحال عند نشوء هذه الكتابة وصولاً إلى القرن ال19. والمقصود بالماضي التاريخي هو المبنى أو النسخة الانتقائية للماضي التي ينظر إليها في مجتمع ما كمجموع كل الأحداث والكينونات التي وجدت في الماضي. إنه الماضي المشكل حصرياً في كتب المشتغلين بالتاريخ ومنشوراتهم، وكأنه غاية بذاته، ويكاد يكون بلا أدنى قيمة لفهم الحاضر، حاضر المتلقي، حاضر الذي يقرأ التاريخ، ويفرغ من الإرشادات لأي فعل راهن أو حتى لاستشراف المستقبل. فيما الماضي العملي الذي يدعو وايت إلى الالتفات إليه هو الذي يعتمده الأشخاص أفرادا أو منتمين إلى جماعة ليستلوا منه الأفكار والنماذج التي تعينهم على تقييم حاضرهم واتخاذ القرارات فيه. الماضي هذا عملي بالمعنى الكانتي للكلمة نسبة إلى كانت، أي إنه متولد من الوعي بضرورة القيام بشيء ما على أساس قانون أخلاقي. تفيد التفرقة بين هذين الماضيين للتمييز بين مناهج بعض المختصين بالتاريخ في تناول الماضي ودراسته، وبين الطرق التي يتوسلها عموم الأفراد والمشتغلون باختصاصات أخرى في سبيل الإفادة من الماضي كمساحة للتجربة الإنسانية تؤسس لكل أنواع الأحكام القيمية والقرارات في الحياة اليومية. لكن ما هي بالضبط مادة التاريخ العملي؟ كما الماضي التاريخي يحيل الماضي العملي إلى الماضي الحقيقي، لكنه يركز على جوانب من ذلك الماضي يهملها الماضي التاريخي، لأنها لا تفرز الشواهد التوثيقية التي تسمح بإعادة تركيب تاريخية صحيحة لجزء من الماضي، أي تلك المواقف أو الجوانب غير المطواعة للتدقيق العلمي الموضوعي وإن كانت حقيقية جدا، كعلاقات الحب مثلا، فالأخيرة يمكن استعادتها بدراسة عملية من خلال الافتراض التخيلي فقط. ولعل نوع الرواية الحديثة هو ميدان الخطاب الأبرز الذي ينبسط فيه التاريخ العملي اليوم في المجتمعات الغربية. يقول وايت: ليست المعالجة الأدبية الفنية الشعرية للتاريخ الحقيقي هنا معالجة قصصية بمعنى كونها من نوع القصص التي هي محض اختلاق أو خيال. نهتم إذن بالماضي العملي كي نتجاوز الوقائع بحدها التقليدي في الفكر التاريخي، كي نتخطى فكرة كوننا نتعرف على الواقع التاريخية عندما نعارضها بالقصة، القصة التي هي شيء متولد من الخيال. وأن نحن نظرنا في تركيب الخبر المسند وهو الوحدة السردية التي تنهض عليها الكتابة التاريخية الإسلامية المبكرة على خلفية هذه التفرقة النظرية بين الماضيين العملي والتاريخي، نخلص إلى الآتي. هلا هون نحن عم نجرب نعمل إسقاط مباشر لأفكار وايت على التراث العربي، عم نستعير لحتى نجرب نفهم أكثر. لسنا هنا أمام مادتين مختلفتين تماماً تقدم فيهما معالجتان نصيتان مختلفتان للماضي الحقيقي، بل هي مادة خبرية واحدة تكتنف بعداً تاريخياً وبعداً عملياً من خلال جزئي الخبر الرئيسين السند والمتن، وتتأرجح هذه المادة بين بعديها هذين متأثرة بعمليات ضبطها ونقلها والاشتغال بها في أنواع المصادر المختلفة. ثانياً، سلاسل الإسناد المتصلة عموماً بكل خبر مروي في هذه الكتابة هي مظهر صريح للانتقائية في تحديد الماضي الإسلامي، وتقوم انتقائية الإسناد على مستويين: مستوى الذاكرة فالرواة الأخبار المروية سجلتها ذاكرتهم، وعملية التذكر انتقائية جدا لأنها تجربة ذاتية. وبمستوى ثاني هو مستوى المصنفين، فالتأليف التاريخية هي أوعية حشدت فيها آلاف الأخبار المسندة انتقاها المصنفون بأنفسهم، لأنهم رأوا أن هذه الأخبار تستحق أن ننتقيها وأن نسجلها، وتلك الأخبار نريد أن نسقطها. بالمقابل يمكن القول أن متون الأخبار هي الجزء الذي يشدها إلى العملية، فمنها تستل العبر والعظات والسنن، وربما تمهد متون الأحاديث لنوع خاص من العملية، لأنها تؤسس للعمل والتكليف في الإطار الشرعي الملزم. والعمل هنا أقتبس قولا لابن خلدون: العمل إنما يجب بما يغلب على الظن صدقه من أخبار رسول الله. وبالعودة إلى مظلة الأخبار العريضة، فلعل نقل الأخبار مسندة في غير كتب التاريخ أو الحديث، أو حتى متخففة من أسانيدها، يحررها ولو إلى حين من قيد تاريخيتها، ويوجه القارئ المتلقي إلى عمليتها المباشرة. وكما يوجه الاشتغال بالأخبار في نصوص المصادر نفسها تارة صوب تاريخيتها وطورا صوب عمليتها، فكذا المقاربات المختلفة المعتمدة في معالجتها في الدراسات المعاصرة من خلال التركيز على مزايا معينة دون أخرى، أو على كتب محددة دون سواها، وهذا بدوره يؤثر على نظرة المتلقي إلى الأخبار قيد الدرس. ولعل كتاب تاريخ الرسل والملوك للطبري هو التعبير الأشهر والأشمل والأبين عن فكرة الماضي التاريخي في التراث الإسلامي، ففيه ذكر أخبار الماضين منذ ابتداء الخلق حتى زمان المؤلف، أي إنه يحيل على كل الماضي الحقيقي من أوله إلى آخره. وهذه مادة نصية ضخمة قلما يستوعبها كتاب واحد. وإذ ألف الطبري كتابه هذا على طريقة المحدثين، موردا فيه أخبار الوقائع مسندة إلى رواتها، فقد ثبت معيار الانتقائية الحاكم في تركيب الماضي التاريخي، لما في ظاهرة الإسناد نفسها من ترسيخ لهذا المعيار كما بينا آنفا. فكيف نقرأ في الطبري خبر سبب مقتل الإمام علي، وكيف تقربه شعريته من العملية المفيدة؟ يروي خبر المذكور خبر سبب مقتل الإمام علي تعاقد 3 رجال بينهم عبد الرحمن بن ملجم على قتل أئمة الضلالة علي ومعاوية وعمرو بن العاص، إراحة للبلاد وثأرا لأهل النهروان، وأنهم بعد اتفاقهم على موعد واحد لتنفيذ الاغتيالات ال3 أقبل كل رجل منهم إلى المصر الذي فيه صاحبه الذي يطلب، وكان ابن ملجم المتطوع لقتل علي. فلما قدم الكوفة، هون راح أقتبس بس 3-4 أسطر من الخبر اللي هو بغطي 3-4 صفحات. لقي امرأة من تيم الرباب يقال لها قطامي، وقد قتل علي أباها وأخاها يوم النهروان، وكانت فائقة الجمال، فلما رآها التبست بعقله ونسي حاجته التي جاء لها، ثم خطبها فقالت: لا أتزوجك حتى تشفي لي. قال: وما يشفيك؟ قالت: 3000 وعبد وقينة وقتل علي بن أبي طالب. تبدو مصادفة ابن ملجم قطامي في لحظتها الأولى ملهاة خطيرة عن مهمته التي من أجلها جاء الكوفة. يتسق وصف قطام فائقة الجمال مع صورة المرأة الحسناء التي تجذب الرجل وتأسره، أي تلهيه بمعنى ما. قد يحسب القارئ لوهلة أن قطامي هي المفترق الذي سيبدل اتجاه الأحداث المروية، لكن يتكشف له تواليا أنها المحفز الأقوى الذي سيدفع نحو الهدف المخطط له، أي قتل علي، ليس فقط في التحريض عليه بل في مشاركة فاعلة في عملية القتل، بدءا بجعل قتله جزءا من مهرها واستجلابها من يسند ابن ملجم في تنفيذ العملية، وتأزيرها إياه ومرافقيه اللذين شاركاه بعملية القتل بالحرير، حتى إن حضور هؤلاء إليها وهي في المسجد معتكفة عندما عزموا على الأمر يؤكد على حركيتها الفاعلة، وكأنها القطب المرجع الذي يدور في فلكه فعل القتل المطلوب. لكن الخبر وإن كان بظاهره واضحا في تفصيلاته فإن بعضها يظل مستغلقا ومشوشا. فلماذا كانت قطامي معتكفة في المسجد؟ ولماذا جاء إليها ابن ملجم وصحبه؟ ولما عصبتهم بالحرير؟ إن الاستغراق في تفصيلات مماثلة يقدم في الخبر بعده التاريخي ويبتعد به عن العملية، فليست هذه التفصيلات على الأرجح هي ما يشغل بال القارئ غير المختص بالتاريخ، حتى عندما يتعلق الأمر بما يبدو أنه تفصيل واضح لا ريب فيه كاسم قطامي في الخبر مثلا. فالقارئ غير المختص ربما لن يتوقف عند معناه. حدا فيكم سأل شو يعني قطامي؟ أوكي. ولن يقرأ ما سجل عن قطامي في الموسوعة الإسلامية عوض مثلا عن أن يكتب ورقة بحثية عن ذلك. هذا إذا افترضنا أن هذا القارئ قد وضع تاريخ الطبري بين يديه وقرأ الخبر أصلا. وعودة إلى قطامي، نقرأ في الموسوعة الإسلامية أنه وبالنظر إلى عدد المصادر التي تذكرها فلا ريب من أنه كانت هناك امرأة تدعى قطامي وأنها انتمت إلى تيم الرباب. تعبر هذه الجملة عن مقاربة تاريخية، أي مقاربة تراعي الماضي التاريخي، لأنها خلاصة بحث مختص مقارن بين المصادر. تمحص هذه المصادر على كونها الشاهد الوحيد الحقيقي المتبقي على وجود تلك المرأة. لكن إن نحن نحونا بشخصية قطامي صوب العملية، يمكن أن نسأل فيما يشبه قلبا لهذه الجملة التقريرية التاريخية: هل يهم فعلا أن تكون قطامي قد وجدت ما دامت حاضرة في خبر القتل وما دمنا نحن نتذكرها؟ الذاكرة بهذا المعنى بوابة للعملية، فأي خبر نستل منه فائدة عملية أخلاقية لابد أن نتذكره، حتى لا يمكن القول إن معيار الفصل بين ما نعده تعبيراً عن الماضي التاريخي أو الماضي العملي في تراثنا الخبري هو التفريق بين ما تذكره الرواة، أي الأخبار المسندة كما هي في مصادرها، وبين ما سيتذكره القراء منها. فهل سيتذكر أحد مثلا أن الخبر الذي نتناوله يبدأ بإسناد حدثني موسى بن عثمان بن عبد الرحمن المسروقي قال حدثنا عبد الرحمن الحراني أبو عبد الرحمن قال أخبرنا إسماعيل بن راشد قال؟ لا. لعل أول ما ستختزنه الذاكرة هو ثالوث علي وقطامي وابن ملجم. لكن لماذا سنتذكر قطامي؟ لماذا تستوقفنا تلك الجمل التي تخبر عن افتتان ابن ملجم بقطامي الحسناء وتستجرنا لملاحقة أثر ذلك الافتتان ومآله فيما تبقى من الخبر؟ إنه ببساطة سحر الحب. إنه ذلك الجزء من واقعة القتل الذي تعسر إعادة تمثيله إذا كنا نريد أن نعيد تمثيل الواقعة أو مسرحتها، والذي لا نستطيع القبض عليه تاريخياً. لكنه على ذلك الجزء الذي يخلف وقعاً شديداً علينا إن لم نقل الوقع الأشد، لأنه يلامس مكمن الضعف الإنساني الذي يعرفه كل منا. ولعل جانباً من شعرية الحب كامن في تحويله القضايا الكبرى إلى قضايا شخصية صغيرة تقدم العلاقات الشخصية إلى الواجهة، وبذلك تقرب الوقائع إلى المتلقي. هنا تحول الثأر لأهل النهروان جميعاً إلى ثأر لوالد قطامي وأخيها. وهنا نسأل: ألا يحاكي ثأر قطامي من علي ثأر هند بنت عتبة من الحمزة بن عبد المطلب؟ ذلك الثأر الذي يكاد يأخذ بكل وقائع معركة أحد في السنة الثالثة للهجرة. فهل نتذكر من تلك المعركة، أي من معركة أحد، سوى ثلاثية هند وحمزة ووحشي العبد الذي أوكلته بقتل حمزة؟ بالانتقال إلى الشعر، يذيل الطبري الخبر بعدد من الأبيات، سأقرأ 3 منها. ولم أر مهرا ساقه ذو سماحة كمهر قطام من فصيح وأعجمي، 3000 وعبد وقينة وضرب علي بالحسام المصمم، فلا مهر أغلى من علي وأن غلا، ولا قتل إلا دون قتل ابن ملجم. لعل هذه الأبيات الثلاثة التي ينسبها الطبري لابن أبي مياس المرادي أحد شعراء الخوارج تندرج في خانة شعر التعليق أو الشرح الذي يساق بعد واقعة مسرودة فيعقب عليها، لكن دون أن يدفع بسلسلة الأحداث قدما، أي أنه يرددها بطريقة مختلفة. وهذا التكثيف التعبيري من خلال الانتقال من الخبر الطويل إلى أبيات معدودات هو تحشيد للمؤثرات الوجدانية، لأنه يغدو أشد وطئا على المتلقي، فتتضاعف الشعرية النصية وتنمو علاوة على التكثيف التعبيري. فإن قصر الأبيات الشعر الموزونة يجعلها سهلة للحفظ والاقتباس، بخلاف الخبر المنثور الذي يسبقها، وسهولة حفظها تيسر بدورها تذكرها، وذاكرة كما أسلفنا هي بوابة للعملية. وأن نحن استوحينا من قول أحد الباحثين إن من أوجه العبقرية في مقاربة الطبري لكتابة التاريخ كونه مستوعبا مستويين من الخطاب، الاتجاه التاريخي الجمعي العام والانطباعات والمشاعر الخاصة التي تفصح عنها أصوات الأفراد. يمكن أن نعقب فنقول إنه يكتنف بذلك نزعتين: الأولى تنحو صوب الماضي التاريخي الذي يعبر عنه الخبر المسند عموما على اعتبار سرد وقائع الماضي، والثانية تأخذ باتجاه الماضي العملي من خلال الأشعار الناطقة بأصوات أفراد تفاعلوا مع الواقعة المروية، إذ يمهد هذا التفاعل الفردي الشخصي، ولأنه أقرب إلى وجدان القارئ وبالتالي أشد تأثيراً عليه لاستلال العبرة الأخلاقية العملية من الواقعة المتناولة، وإن بواسطة شعر معارض كما هي الحال هنا. فلا يخفف من هالة هذه الأبيات الشعرية التأثيرية كونها تعبر عن صوت خارجي عن عموم اتفاق الجماعة الإسلامية آنذاك، لأنها سجلت في ذيل هذه الواقعة وستظل تستعاد وتذكر. وبالمناسبة كل الصيغ وكل تنويعات خبر قتل علي بكل المصادر ملحقة بها هذه الأبيات الثلاثة. إذا كانت الشعرية التي يكتنزها الخبر محفزاً للعبور به إلى العملية، إن في حديث الحب أو في الأبيات المعدودة التي تحاكي الحب، فأي عبرة عملية هي التي تستقى منه؟ كيف يجيب الخبر عن سؤال ماذا نفعل الآن وهنا؟ هل تختزل عمليته بجملة مبسطة مثل لا تقتل، أو القتل خطأ، أو حافظ على صلاتك في أوقاتها أو حتى أوفي بعهدك إذا عاهدت؟ كيف نستخلصها من الخبر؟ هل يقتصر الأمر على استنتاجات حرة يستلها القارئ بنفسه عبر تفاعله هو وحده مع نص الخبر؟ ربما تشوش المقولات الأخلاقية الثابتة التي يتحدد بها حسن فعل ما أو قبحه على الفوارق بين الأفراد المتلقين للخبر على اختلاف العصور والمنازل الفكرية والعلمية، على اعتبار أن قبح القتل متفق عليه مثلا، وإن كان الكلام عن قتل علي أو غير علي. فالخلاصة العملية مفادها أن القتل قبيح ومنهي عن فعله. سنبين أدناه أن الاختلاف لا يقع فقط على مستوى تعيين قبح هذا الفعل أو ذاك، بل في التركيز على أفعال محددة في الخبر والبناء عليها، وكل منها يفرز تالياً مبادئ عملية مختلفة. كل مصنف يستحضر الخبر يقيد حرية القارئ في التفاعل معه، يحبسه في سياق محدد موجها إياه نحو خلاصة عملية معينة. هنا سأستحضر خبراً يرويه الجاحظ في كتاب المحاسن والأضداد في باب اسمه محاسن المتكلمات. يورد الجاحظ هذا الخبر في بداية هذا الباب، يقول: قيل وقدم كثير عزة الشاعر المشهور، وقدم كثير الكوفة وكان شيعياً من أصحاب محمد بن الحنفية، فقال: دلوني على منزل قطامي. وقيل له: وما تريد منها؟ قال: أريد أن أوبخها في قتل علي بن أبي طالب. فقيل له: عد عن رأيك فإن عقلها ليس كعقول النساء. قال: لا والله لا أنتهي حتى أنظر إليها وأكلمه. فخرج يسأل عن منزلها حتى دفع إليه، عمل براسه يعني وراح. فاستأذن فأذنت له، فرأى امرأة برزة وقد تخددت وقد حنى الدهر من قناتها. يعني الظاهر أنه هو لما راح لعند قطامي كان صار مرق وقت طويل، يعني كانت صارت ختيارة. فقالت: من الرجل؟ قال: كثير بن عبد الرحمن. قالت: التيمي الخزاعي؟ قال: التيمي الخزاعي. ثم قال لها: أنت قطامي؟ قالت: نعم. قال: أنت صاحبة علي بن أبي طالب صلوات الله عليه؟ قالت: بل صاحبة عبد الرحمن بن ملجم. قال: أليس هو قتل عليا؟ قالت: بل مات بأجله. الخبر طبعا طويل ويغطي ما يربو على الصفحة، وتفحم فيه قطامي كثير حتى أنها تعارضه بأشعار ألا قلت كما قال امرؤ القيس، يعني تفحمه للزلمة. يستبطن عنوان الباب بذاته حكما قيميا إيجابيا ينحو بالقارئ إلى حسن كلام النساء قبل قراءة ما فيه، والتعرف على النساء اللاتي قد يذكر أطراف من كلامهن فيه. ويمكن القول بدءا إن الخبر متحرر من بعده التاريخي بتحرره من الإسناد، إذ يتصدره الفعل قيل، وهذا لا يرسخه قواقع منتخبة في الماضي التاريخي، لكنه على ذلك متصل بذلك الماضي، لأن في خلفيته يحوم طيف خبر سبب مقتل الإمام علي المسند. فسبب زيارة كثير لقطامي كما قيل هو لتوبيخها في قتل الإمام علي. هنا يسجل لقطامي أن عقلها ليس كعقول النساء، ويترجم ذلك ما نقل من حوار بينها وبين زائرها الشيعي. فهي تنافحه في الكلام فتنسخ كلامه بما تراه أصح. في قوليها المتصلين مباشرة بواقعة مقتل الإمام علي في قولها بل أنا صاحبة عبد الرحمن، بل مات بأجله، إبطال لمعنى كلامه ورد عليه، وكأنها تتبرأ من النسبة إلى علي وتبرئ ابن ملجم من قتله، مخالفة بذلك ما هو راسخ أو واقع ولو بالكلام. يحرف كلام قطامي عما هو مسجل في الماضي التاريخي، يعني حتى هي مش من باب التهكم، من باب أنها بتعرف تجاوب. بدليل روايته هنا، فخبر الجاحظ يجعل القارئ يرى قطامي من منظور يوضع به جانبا دورها في قتل الإمام علي، وإن كان الخبر عن أحد جاء لتوبيخها في هذا القتل. فالخبر يريدنا عمليا أن نتوقف عند حسن جواب قطامي. في كتاب ذم الهوى لابن الجوزي يفتتح ابن الجوزي باب ذكر من حمله العشق على قتل الناس بتنويع أخرى أقصر لخبر مقتل الإمام علي، ويقتبس في آخرها الأبيات الثلاثة إياها. يغلب اقتباس الخبر في سياق هذا الكتاب وفي مفتتح هذا الباب بعده العملي على بعده التاريخي، وهو الكتاب الذي وضعه المصنف كما يقول لذم الهوى في شهوات الحس، إذ لما كان الغالب من موافق الهوى أنه لا يقف منه على حد محتفظا بالسمة الأكثر موافق الهوى أنه لا يقف منه على حد، أطلق ذم الهوى والشهوات. هنا يتضاءل التاريخ وإن كان الخبر مسندا، أي محتفظا بالسمة الأكثر التصاقا بالتاريخية التي هي الإسناد، إذ ليس القصد من استحضاره سرد واقعة القتل، أي أنه حدا يخبرنا شو صار. يصبح الخبر تمثيلا على فكرة المصنف، ويتجلى التوجيه صوب العملية في الذم المطلق المضاف إليه العشق المذكور الذي يوضحه مقتل الإمام علي. ولعل إيراد الخبر قبل غيره في هذا الباب يدلل على وعي ضمني بحضوره في أذهان القراء، ولنا ألا نستغرب توظيف واقعة تاريخية مشهورة مماثلة لصالح موعظة مباشرة من قبل ابن الجوزي أشهر الوعاظ على الإطلاق. فإذا كان ما أوردناه أعلاه في المحاسن والأضداد للجاحظ الأديب فيه أثر إرشادي عملي ما، فإن اقتباس الخبر لدى ابن الجوزي في سياقه الوعظي المركز ضمن كتاب مخصص للموضوع المذكور يشبعه بالوعظ العملي، إذ لا يتعرض القارئ هنا إلى شيء من لطائف الأدب، والتي وإن حملت ما يشبه الوعظ فهي تظل مؤنسة للروح والقلب، بل إلى وعظ ديني مباشر يقترب من الزجر والنهي. أخيراً، في السياق الفقهي يبلغ البعد العملي للخبر منتهى. نقرأ في كتاب الإمامة وقتال البغاة في تلخيص الحبير لابن حجر العسقلاني: قال الشافعي: وابن ملجم المرادي قتل عليا متأولا. قال الرافعي: أراد الشافعي أنه قتله زاعما أن له شبهة وتأويلا باطلا. وحكى أن تأويله أن امرأة من الخوارج تسمى قطامي خطبها ابن ملجم، وكان علي قتل أباها في جملة الخوارج، وكلته في القصاص، فشرطت عليه 3000 درهم وعبد وقينة لتحببه في ذلك. إن في وضع فعل ابن ملجم في دائرة التأويل نوعا من الضبط أو التصحيح الأخلاقيين، إذ هو يمنحه مظلة من شرعية أعطاها ابن ملجم لنفسه. فالتأويل المحكي يجعل من القتل أمرا مشروعا مسموحا به، يعني من باب أنه القصاص الشرعي المطلوب العادل. لكن التأويل هذا منحصر في دائرة زعم ابن ملجم نفسه، ويبدو أن أقوال العلماء اختلفت في توصيف هذا التأويل ونعته. فهذا ابن حجر لا يتفق وحكاية الشافعي إن ابن ملجم كان يرى أنه يقيم حد القصاص على علي بوكالته من قطامي، مستدلا بالظاهر في سياق الشعر أنها اشترطت القتل في مهرها لا في دائرة القصاص. كما ويجد ابن حزم مبالغا في قوله إنه هو بيورد حكي لابن حزم، بس أنا ما حطيت الاقتباس، جزء منه اللي بيقوله ابن حزم إنه لا خلاف بين أحد من الأئمة في أن ابن ملجم قتل عليا متأولا مجتهدا مقدرا أنه على الصواب. مردفا هون شو بيرد ابن حجر إن هذا الكلام لا خلاف في بطلانه، إلا إن حمل كذا على أنه كذلك كان عند نفسه، إنه ابن ملجم بس بينه وبين حاله. فنعم، وإلا فيما يكن ابن ملجم قط من أهل الاجتهاد ولا كاد. هل يخفف هذا الكلام من وطأة فعل القتل إياه؟ لعله لا يفعل، لكن أليست الإشارة إلى تقدير الصواب وإن كان عند ابن ملجم نفسه فقط غطاء أخلاقيا له؟ وإن كان مجمعا على بطلانه شرعا، كون الأخير لم يكن على قول ابن حجر من المؤهلين للاجتهاد. هل يتقاطع الحكم الأخلاقي العملي هنا مع الحكم الشرعي أم إنهما يتعارضان؟ ألا يجعلنا التأمل عمليا في هذا الموقف الصعب نرى شقاوة ابن ملجم مضاعفة؟ يردنا التفكير مليا بالأمر إلى سؤال: ماذا نفعل الآن وهنا؟ قد تكون الإجابة على السؤال إياه في ظل فعل القتل هذا الراسخ في ماضينا معقدة وربما ملتبسة أحيانا، ربما تيسرها العودة إلى النصوص التي عالجناها لنقرأها، لنسألها، لنألفها، لنقرأها مرة أخرى كأن لم نقرأها من قبل في كل مرة. شكرا.
Shukran, Mariam. Thank you. Our next speaker now is Dana Sajdi. Dana is Associate Professor of History at Boston College. Her work has focused on the production of texts by unusual authors, such as an 8th century woman poet, Layla al-Akhyaliya, and an 18th century barber, Ibn Budayr. Her questions had to do with the politics of the production and consumption of texts and the unusual circumstances that allowed new types of authors to emerge. Her current project, Visualizing Damascus, is also about textual production, but this time the subject is on the descriptions of the venerable city. Damascus. She is trying to isolate and identify an uninterrupted tradition of prose topographies between the 12th and 20th century. Through this tradition, she hopes to write a history of Damascus for both academic and lay audiences. Her book, The Barber of Damascus, Nouveau Literacy in the 18th Century Ottoman Levant, was published by Stanford University Press in 2013. Join me in welcoming Dana Sajdi, and the title of her talk today is From Diyarat to Ziyarat, the Transmutation of the Sacred and Generic Landscape in Syria.
Shukran. Thank you, Livia. I feel first of all, thank you for your paper. It was wonderful. I feel very lucky to be one of the chosen ones here. Ali and Dalia, thank you very much. And Aliya, thank you for facilitating this. I don't know where she is. The skill of the historian is to turn a fact into an event and with consequence. And so, Tarif, I might be a fact of your life, but you are an event in my life. So I know that I never studied with you directly. We never met more than like 3-4 times in my life. But the way I want to show the audience how important Tarif was for my intellectual life is to read you the very first sentence of my book, The Barber of Damascus. And it starts, narcissistically quoting myself. This book arises from a footnote, note 13 on page 188 of Tarif Khalidi's book, Arabic Historical Thought in the Classical Period, upon which I chanced more than a decade ago. Before I divulge the contents of the fateful footnote, a bit of background is in order. So I'll stop the quote here because you don't need the background right now. But basically, Tarif has launched me in my career. And so thank you. I have a very projectful, loud voice. Do I need the... I don't, right? للتسجيل. It's my theater training. I can't help it. This presentation is an inquiry into two seemingly unrelated literary genres that emerged in different periods, in different time periods, but which I'll suggest are related. The first is known as diyarat, the books of monasteries. They come from dair, adira, diyarat. The genre seems to have appeared in the 9th century and peaked in the following century in courtly circles. Soon thereafter, the genre ceases to exist independently, but its contents were absorbed into larger, often voluminous geographical literature. The other genre that I will treat is ziyarat, and the rhyming here is a coincidence. These are shrine pilgrimage guides from singular ziyara. So visit, the visitation of graves and mausolea. Although presaged by the genre of religious virtues, yani fada'il, and actualized in reference to travel and geographical literature, pilgrimage guides took exactly the opposite trajectory to their monastery counterparts. Shrines were first enumerated in larger geographical compendia before they later emerged in an especially dedicated book in the 13th century. This transmutation of genre through the funnel of geographical compendia, which absorbed one genre, the diyarat, and gave birth to the other, the ziyarat, parallels the transformation in the sacred landscape and in the very polity. I would like to suggest that these two genres performed a similar function in that they allowed the inscription of two very different kinds of authority as experiences in sacred liminality, one in a Christian space and the other in the very same place after it had been Islamized. As such, the text not only signifies spatial identity, but perpetuates authority and confirms the social order. Monastery guides refracted a caliphal period, its ideal of centralized power and its refined courtly culture, while pilgrimage books mirrored the sultanic age and the hegemony and diffuse power of the professional scholar. Thus, the genre of diyarat was replaced by ziyarat, but this replacement was not a matter of one genre ejecting the other. Rather, the change in polity from caliphal authority to that of sultan scholar and the concomitant Islamization of the cityscape demanded an appropriate spatial genre to represent and perpetuate the new configuration. It's not surprising then that the disappearance of one genre and the appearance of the other took place between the 11th and 13th centuries, precisely when the caliphate was coming to an end, while a professional scholarly class was emerging under the patronage of sultans. Although Aleppo and Baghdad are necessary part of the treatment here, in tracing the sacred landscape, my focus is going to be on Damascus and its environs. I will start with exploring the genre of diyarat, which, while being framed as a geographical genre, is equally, if unexpectedly, biographical. Offering snapshots of caliphal activities at monasteries, the genre inscribes and confirms caliphal authority. Then we will visit Damascus in the 11th to the 13th century, when the majority of the population had become Muslim, to see how the spatial Islamization of the city and accompanying disappearance or conversion of monasteries occurred under a new polity. Finally, I will turn to the genre of ziyarat. Also of geographical generic provenance, it too became eventually heavily biographical, thus mirroring the structure and function of diyarat. The shift towards the biographical in ziyarat coincides with a parallel change in the identity of the subjects of the text. While biblical prophets and the companions and relatives of the Prophet Muhammad had been the main objects of veneration, the text opened up to include scholars, thus sacralizing them and confirming their authority. 4 out of the half dozen or so standalone diyarat books were produced under the patronage of Saif al-Dawla, who died roughly in the middle of the 10th century. The most famous of the Hamdanids, a princely dynasty with Shia inclinations that ruled Aleppo between 944 and 1002. Authored by poets and literati, all the monastery guidebooks that were produced by members of Saif al-Dawla's literary circle are lost. However, some of these lost texts were cited so extensively in the later works that a modern editor was able to collate parts of Abu al-Faraj al-Isfahani's volume, which was written in the late 10th century. Only one largely extant example of diyarat written in the same period was not produced in Aleppo, but in Fatimid Cairo by Abu al-Hasan al-Shabushti, who died late 10th century. The author served as the librarian of and the boon and book companion to the Fatimid ruler Al-Aziz ibn al-Mu'izz. Given its foundational and largely extant status, I will describe Shabushti's ad-Diyarat to glean out the template of the genre while simultaneously show its representations of the monastery as the site of Muslim subversive excess or indulgence. The book is arranged geographically, first covering the monasteries of Iraq, then Syria, to list only 3 monasteries. That part seems to have is missing. And lastly, Egypt, to list 9 counterparts. The author starts each section by naming the monastery, defining the location, and describing the terrain, usually its verdant nature, orchards and vineyards, and commanding views. One of the ways by which the author emphasizes the beauty of the location is to describe it as a place visited by the people of delight and diversion, or it's never empty of people of debauchery and delight, and its spot brims with picnickers, or a place sought for the purpose of picnicking and drinking. If the monastery is famous for a holiday festival, the date or occasion is given, followed by a description of the usually raucous festivities attended by both Christians and Muslims. Some monasteries are identified as sanatoria of sorts, famous for the provision of cures. Others are loci of vows and votive offerings, known for granting the wishes of all manner of supplicants. Regardless of the unique characteristic of any particular monastery, the focus of every section in the book is poetry and stories about or associated with the monastery, uttered by a Muslim poet who is usually in the company of a caliph, a prince, or administrator, often along with an entourage of boon companions, singers, musicians, and other poets. The essential themes are activities of sensuous enjoyment of nature and music, profligate indulgence in wine, and licentious love of beautiful boys and chaste nuns. With rare exceptions, the monastery in Shabushti's book is a building or structure defined in the most basic way by symbolic markers of Christianity, but is really a receptacle of Muslim excess, a place of forbidden delights. The stories are infused with Islamic paradisiacal images, did I pronounce this right? Verdant surroundings, beardless boys, luminescent virgins, and lots of wine. Whether the debauched activities mentioned in the poetry or stories took place or not is not my point here. Monasteries allowed Muslims to imagine paradise on earth. It is, as Elizabeth Campbell described it, a heaven of wine. This framework of the monastery as of Muslim excess seems to be the template of the genre. I do not have time to show how the later geographical compendia, such as Ibn Fadl al-Umari's Masalik al-Absar, which is 14th century, or Yaqut al-Hamawi's Mu'jam al-Buldan, which is late 13th century, they preserve many of the portions of the lost text, but they follow the exact same template. This template hides a tension in the text between geography versus biography. Each section, in addition to being concerned with a single monastery, is equally about a single figure, sometimes two or three, but mostly it's one person. In other words, every location is associated with a person, rendering each geography closely associated with a biography. Indeed, the modern editor of Shabushti's book, Korkis Awad, had noticed this tendency, and I quote him here. Shabushti offers news, stories, anecdotes, and verse that in their totality are not related to the monastery itself, but with the people who have recited poetry about it or to whom an incident occurred in it, or fell upon a piece of news that is closely or distantly associated with it. Each monastery, which Shabushti treats extensively, is almost solely devoted to the reports about a single person from the luminaries in the fields of literature, politics, and administration: a caliph, a prince, an author, a literati, a poet, a boon companion, unquote. In other words, each monastery entry is a biography or a snapshot of the activities of an archetypal member of the caliphal court, if not the caliph himself. When taken together, the collectivity represents the government bureaus, the dawawin, and royal social, literary, musical assemblies, majalis. While the fikrs and activities represent the quintessential caliphal court, the context and location may be seen as anti-courtly. A short exploration of this anti-courtliness is necessary. The point is to show how the liminality of the location of the monastery and its use by Muslim royals as a space of subversive anti-normativity serves to confirm royal authority. Monasteries have, sorry, I have to go back to Victor Turner. I know it's so démodé now, but monasteries have been identified as the quintessential example of institutionalized liminality. And these are the words of Victor Turner, in which social distinction and hierarchical arrangements are neutralized. The monastery is a spatially marginal anti-structure that serves to confirm the social structure and political order in the center, usually the city. The portrayal in Diyarat of the temporary use of this permanently liminal space by Muslim confirms this liminality. The use of monasteries by the members of the caliphal court allows them to reside for a short while outside hierarchy, law, and property. Status is temporarily suspended, allowing figures of authority release from their responsibilities and license to engage in what is normally or structurally forbidden, rendering the monastery a place of Muslim subversive excess. The visit ends, hierarchy resumes, and the caliph's status as the ruler of all Muslims is confirmed. This is the reason why monasteries, the most unlikely places in Islamic polity, became, according to Elizabeth Campbell, quote, symbolic sites of ritual performances of authority and the establishment of royal legitimacy, unquote. To demonstrate, and in the interest of time, I will skip the representations of Umayyads and most Abbasid royals in monasteries. In the written paper, I have it all. I will keep my examples to two. The first is about the Abbasid Caliph al-Mutawakkil visits to the Syrian monastery of al-Rusafa, which is associated with the Umayyad Caliph Hisham. The two caliphs are a century apart, and it will be remembered for those who don't know that the Abbasids hated the Umayyads and they set up their regime against them. On his famous 3-month journey to Damascus, in 1858 precisely, purportedly to inspect the city as a possible new capital. It's a matter of debate whether he went for that motivation, but for my argument it suits me very well. Al-Mutawakkil walks by the monastery's wall to find a note containing verses expressing longing for Umayyad rule. I'm not going to quote the poem, it's very long, but trust me, it says, the poem basically places not only the Khalifa Hisham, his son, and the Marwanids, all the Marwanid branch of the Umayyads in the monastery, but also sees it as the base of their caliphate. And the line says, in it, life was lush and the caliphate was fresh, unquote. The poet compares life under the Abbasids to being prisoner in tight shackles. He hopes for the day when fortunes change, for Umayyad rule to return. What a slap in the face, for poor Mutawakkil. So upon reading these verses, Al-Mutawakkil was terrified, irta'a. He called upon a monk to inquire about the identity of the writer of the verses. The monk denied any knowledge. The caliph was about to kill him when a boon companion saved the day and said, this monk is not one who prefers one regime over another, unquote. So what is interesting here, they don't declare him as pro-Abbasid. He's out of the game. The happy fate of the monk notwithstanding, the point here is the extent to which monasteries are associated with caliphal authority. So much so that the Abbasids are seen anxious to revise the history literally written into the walls of these Syrian monasteries to establish their own legitimacy. The other example is about Sayf al-Dawla, at whose court you will remember several Diyarat books were composed. The time period, the 10th century, is significant. The Hamdanids represent one of the first regimes that signified and ushered the breakup of the Abbasid Caliphate into sultanates and principalities. The arrival of the Seljuks in the following century will inaugurate the basis of a new polity before the Caliphate comes to an end in the 13th century with the Mongol invasion. One of the extant stories about Sayf al-Dawla is one of him standing on the rooftop of Ba'arba monastery, enjoying the views while drinking with his companions in the manner of customary caliphal visits. So the representation fits the general template in this particular instance. The other story, however, portrays the ruler visiting Deir Mart Maruta in Aleppo on account of his mother's request that he be good to the monks. This visit, in other words, is not for the purpose of indulgence. Rather, it is a charity visit. There's no love, no wine, and no excess. Strikingly, the rest of the story, the second story, which is reported in Yaqut's dictionary, ends with the following statement. Quote, the monastery is now gone without a trace, as a new building was erected in its place, which is a mausoleum, which Aleppans claim to have seen al-Husayn ibn Ali, peace be upon him, praying. They gathered money and built the best and strongest building, unquote. So the monastery gave way to an Islamic mausoleum, not museum. The mausoleum, the actual one that he's talking about, dates back to the Ayyubid period, 12th to 13th centuries, still stands today as a testament to Aleppo's Shi'i past. However, the very same Sayf al-Dawla, who patronized all the book of monasteries, was responsible for building of one of the earliest mausoleums that we have in Islamic history. It is another mausoleum, and a Shi'i one at that. It's of al-Muhassan, who is a legendary son of al-Hussein. Memorializing a legendary son of Ali, Sayf al-Dawla built an Islamic mausoleum that probably opened the path to the later appropriation of the very same monastery to which he had paid charitable visits. This mausoleum will become a standard site of visitation in pilgrimage guides. In other words, what was represented in the Diyarat books becomes the subject of the Ziyarat books. And the same frequenter of monasteries, Saif al-Dawla, initiates the Islamization of space. Before exploring the genre of ziyarat, and for the benefit of those who don't know about medieval Syria, I'll turn to the 11th to 13th century Damascus. And I know that some of you know this very well, so I'm sorry to repeat it, but I know that others don't. Let me turn to the period 11th to 13th centuries, during which time Damascus witnessed drastic spatial Islamization. The arrival of the Crusaders created an atmosphere of religious revivalism, and the presence of the Shi'i Fatimids next door imbued this revivalism with a strong Sunni bent. When the famous anti-crusading hero Nuruddin Zenki, who died in the late 12th century, of Turkic Seljuk descent, arrived in Syria to unify it and launch attacks against the Franks, the institution of waqf, or charitable endowment, had become the primary mechanism by which foreign rulers who now dominated the largely Arabic-speaking Middle East established their legitimacy. Lacking the combination of political and religious authority that inhered in the person of the caliph, who had the privilege of being a descendant of the Prophet, Seljuk rulers and their successor regimes, including the Zengids and the Ayyubids, took on the title of sultan to indicate and limit themselves to temporal power, military and administrative. Religious authority became the purview of the local scholars, whose business was the study of the religious sciences. In order to make evident their piety and their willingness to protect Islamic society and to ensure the application of law, sultans patronized the scholars who literally knew better. Alim, the guys knew better, and the women, actually, there's plenty of them in that period. By creating official positions for scholars to occupy, sultans ensured their dependence and gratitude. In the 12th to 13th centuries, scholars, according to John Gilbert, quote, enjoyed unprecedented opportunities. Scores of religious institutions were established, large number of salaried posts for teachers and stipends for students became available, and increasing number of religious scholars from around the Islamic world came to study, many to settle in Damascus, unquote. Now professionalized and present in every part of the city in different capacities, as judges, professors, leaders to prayers, sermonists, market inspectors, etc., and due to their education, enjoying multi-competencies, this is the word of Ira Lapidus, these heirs of the Prophet emerge as the local representatives of their city and commanded obedience and respect. So now the agreement is not between caliph and his mouthpiece, the poet, but between sultan and scholar. A new post-caliphal social contract had been struck. The text of this contract was inscribed in the very topography, which as a result became thoroughly Islamized. The Sultan offered positions to scholars in the forms of new buildings, mosques, Sufi lodges, and colleges, among other amenities. In his extensive documentation of the spatial Islamization of Damascus, Cyril Jalabert, I think, noted the drastic increase in the number of mosques and colleges by the 13th century. Concomitantly, houses of worship of non-Muslims shrank in number. After all, by the 11th century, the population of Damascus had become predominantly Muslim. The same trend of spatial Islamization is demonstrated by the great proliferation of Islamic shrines and mausolea. Damascus became dotted with Islamic holy sites dedicated to people and relics to be venerated, whose blessings to be sought, and to whom or which votive offerings would be made. What happens to monasteries during this period? A few resume their function, others vanish without a trace, and some others get converted to Islamic shrines associated with biblical and exclusively Islamic figures. An anecdote in Yaqut's text serves to show how Islamic shrines and Christian monasteries occupied the same register of meaning and were perceived as immediate competitors in the Islamic and Christian imaginations, respectively. In the entry on Deir al-A'la, the author tells us the story of how some representative of the Sultan appropriated a site near the monastery to build a mausoleum for a companion of the Prophet, but that the monks, quote, worked against it until it closed down, unquote. فصانع الديرانيون عنه حتى أبطل. So both sides understood that a mausoleum meant the eventual disablement or replacement of the monastery. The general trend of disappearance or conversion of monasteries was merely one aspect of a drastically changed sacred landscape. Damascus, in particular, witnessed a makeover. The new social contract between the sultan and scholar, facilitated by the institution of waqf, allowed for the proliferation of Islamic buildings and structures that produced an entirely new cityscape. This is how Damascus became a metropolis again, and a definitely Islamic one at that. So let me turn to ziyarat now, the other genre. Am I in time? Yeah. The first written pilgrimage guide, Al-Isharat ila Amakin al-Ziyarat, is by Ali Abu Bakr al-Harawi, who died in 1215. As an envoy to the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad and Ayyubid regime in Syria, al-Harawi had the opportunity to traverse the heart of Islamic world and even visit Crusader Palestine. Al-Isharat, thus, is based on a tried and true journey and the author's own personal observations. Starting his guide with the city of Aleppo, much of the work is devoted to Syrian shrines, including those of Damascus and its environs. Guides dedicated exclusively to the shrines of Syria do not appear till the 16th century with Ibn al-Hawrani, Al-Isharat ila Ma'rifat al-Ziyarat, the same title almost. Later works on Syrian shrines include those of Mahmud al-Adawi and Yasin al-Faradi al-Biqai. In order to understand how this genre came about, one must refer to the genre of Fada'il, which enumerates, quote, the merits of a particular town or territory, usually taken from hadith and related exegetical, legendary, and historical materials, including biblical lore, unquote. The genre itself is old, but matured between the 9th and 11th centuries, becoming especially handy in the discursive war against the Crusades. The first known and extant complete compilation of Fada'il al-Sham is by Rabai and goes back to the 11th century, that is before the Crusades. This work is not a guide, but is an assignation of holiness to Syria and Damascus, especially in relation to biblical figures and events associated with the sites of Mount Qasyun, which is just northeast of Damascus, helping later authors to specify these locations. The intrepid scholar Ibn Asakir, the author of the first fully articulated topography of Damascus, uses Rabai's reports to establish association between them and particular places in and around Damascus, a task to which he devotes two sections of his topographies. But the genius of Ibn Asakir is that he's not satisfied with just transmitting inherited knowledge about the city, which is the Fada'il. What he does, which I think is revolutionary, is he goes out on the street and walks us through the city to go through a survey of the mosques. He doesn't do that with the shrines. This will fall on Harawi, but what he does is he opens up the space for the city to be observable, walkable, in the here and now. And so he launches a new way of viewing, walking, and writing about the city, and that's the beginning of actually my other project on Damascus. So he opens the door for people to observe spatially, things that are really interesting. If Ibn Asakir text critically combines inherited fada'il with a contemporary description based on walkable paths, Al-Harawi's guide is a full-fledged performance of the latter. The guide leads the reader to follow the author along known travel routes. The author, who is punctilious about providing exact locations, is not only shy to opine about the authenticity of sites and to add his personal experience and observations. So he's all about travel routes and actual and observations. So it is perhaps the author's emphasis on travel routes and on establishing geographical location that led Janine Sourdel to define the parameters of Al-Harawi's guide in terms of the travelogue and geographical compendia, and much less in terms of the fada'il. Although Ibn Asakir literally enshrines holy sites discursively, almost all of the places, whether graves, caves, or mausolea, are related to biblical prophets and do not include those of the companions and relatives of Prophet Muhammad. So it's all biblical. While the visitation of shrines of Muslim figures had been attested earlier in Damascus, they somehow don't make it into Ibn Asakir's book. In al-Harawi's treatment of shrines, however, these exclusively Islamic personalities figure predominantly. In other words, al-Harawi's guide reflects a thoroughly Islamized space, but it still does not work out. Again, I'm going to repeat. So al-Harawi includes companions of the Prophet and exclusively Muslim figures, which Ibn Asakir hadn't done. But al-Harawi's guide reflects a thoroughly Islamized space by now, but it still does not work out the social forces behind the production of such space. In the interest of time, I will have to skip the mediating texts of Shams al-Din ibn Tulun in the 16th century to jump forward to you have to take my word for it, to Ibn al-Hawrani's pilgrimage guide to Syrian shrines in the 16th century, and which is the very first of its kind. Ibn al-Hawrani relies extensively on his Syrian predecessors, al-Raba'i, Ibn Asakir, and Ibn Tulun, but models his work as a guide in the manner of al-Harawi, the first pilgrimage guide. The author begins with a narration of the religious virtues of Syria and the Umayyad Mosque of Damascus in the manner of al-Raba'i and Ibn Asakir respectively. After he finishes describing particular holy spots inside the mosque, the Great Mosque, and within the walled city, like Ibn Asakir's survey of the mosque of the city, the author leads us to the areas immediately adjacent to the city, west, south, east, and then north and north. In this last section, Ibn al-Hawrani follows the footsteps of Ibn Tulun to the sites of the suburb al-Salihiyya and Mount Qasyun. He finishes off our journey through the villages of al-Ghouta. Where al-Hawrani's text differs critically from that of al-Harawi is not only the former's inclusion of scholars' tombs as sites to be venerated and visited. So Ibn al-Hawrani, we have scholars' tombs that is added to the sites, but also his introduction of biography, which does not occur in Ibn al-Harawi. The infiltration of biography onto the text of geography makes Ibn al-Hawrani's book of ziyarat remarkably similar to the genre of diyarat, in which geography was biography. And here is one example. Quote, "Among the tombs in Bab al-Saghir cemetery is Ibn Asakir, is that of Ibn Asakir, the important Quran memorizer, the pride of the Shafi'is, and the master of hadith scholars during his time, and the author of Tarif Dimashq, the history of Damascus. He traveled to many lands and heard from approximately 1,300 shaykhs and women masters. He was pious, beneficent, reciting the entire Quran once every week and once every day of the month of Ramadan, declining official posts when offered to him, abundant in ordering what is commendable and forbidding the reprehensible. He hardly ever relied upon princes, the sons of the worldly life and rulers. He died during the month of Rajab in 571 and was buried in Bab al-Saghir, east of the chamber which contains Muawiyah's tomb, may God please be with him." This entry reads like an excerpt from a biographical dictionary. The only difference is that in this particular genre, the main intention is the geographical location, just as in Diyarat, the Diyarat genre. Both genres constitute invitations to visit, and these are not any visits, but they are invitations to liminal spaces and activities. Both offer extensive biographies of a single authoritative figure. In the quoted biography, the venerated is not any scholar, it's Ibn Asakir, who himself had been the conduit for recognizing a biblical turned Islamic space and for canonizing Damascus, but an Islamizing one in his topography. Ibn Asakir is now himself canonized and sacralized along with the saints and prophets in the same terrain. The very terrain that had once included monasteries full of caliphal revelers. If the monasteries were about royal authorities, shrines were about not only establishing scholarly authority, but sacralizing it. Scholars' graves and biographies take up a significant portion of Ibn al-Hawrani's work. According to Jalabert, 55% of the book is devoted to mystics and scholars. But they are not the exclusive subject. The guidebook includes the usual tour of prophets' shrines in Mount Qasyun, the tombs and mausolea of the relatives of the prophet and his companions and followers, the sites of some relics, such as the prophet's sandal, the graves of Sufi saints, most famously Sheikh Arslan, who dies in the middle of the 12th century, the patron saint of Damascus, and the mausoleums of a few rulers, most recognizably that of Nur ad-Din. It is no coincidence that beyond the prophets and the early Muslim that figure in the work, all of the newly venerated figures and relics date back to the 12th century. The sandal of the prophet and other recently discovered relics are brought to Damascus in this period. Sheikh Arslan was a Sufi saint whose veneration is testament to the spread of Sufism throughout Syria in the 11th to 13th centuries. He is remembered to have taken up residence in a mountaineer crusader besieged Damascus with the intention to fight and protect. This is the reason why he acquired the sobriquet Hami Sham, the protector of Damascus. The saint was venerated by the actual military protector of Damascus, Nur ad-Din, who successfully routed crusader incursions on the city and launched the first systematic jihad effort against crusader principalities. Nur ad-Din's architectural patronage of public buildings in Damascus was unprecedented and unsurpassed. Despite having been branded as a vociferously Sunni ruler who fought against the Fatimid Shi'is, Nur ad-Din is also known for having renovated a Shi'i shrine in Aleppo, the very same shrine that was erected by Saif ad-Dawla a century earlier. Thus, Ibn al-Hawrani's pilgrimage guide is dense with a memory of interrelated holy figures, places, and sites from the 12th century. In other words, the text inscribes the making and makers of Islamic Damascus, which had replaced a Christian terrain of vanishing and converted monasteries. About Ibn Asakir, Ibn al-Hawrani was quite misinformed. In the above quoted biography of the scholar, he is represented as being shy of receiving patronage from and unwilling to serve rulers. The avoidance of cooperation with rulers was a sign of a truly authoritative and pious scholar who was able to resist the temptation of temporal authority. Despite his authoritativeness and the canonical status of his work, we know very well from actually Sulaiman that Ibn Asakir was quite close to Nur ad-Din, who created a special position in an especially erected building, Dar al-Hadith, the first institution of its kind in Damascus, for Ibn Asakir to teach. The cooptation or perhaps mutual benefit is this relationship of the Sultan to the scholar is quite clear. Ibn Asakir too was one of the makers of Islamic Damascus. His topography, it will be remembered, gave Islamic Damascus contemporary relevance and allowed for the genre of ziyarat to come about and to eventually replace diyarat. So at the end of the day, the genre of ziyarat, wittingly or not, is revisionist. It is a history that begins not in the 7th century with the Muslim conquest of the city, but in the 12th century. The genre forgets a Christian Syria that resumed under Muslim rule for centuries and enshrines an Islamic Damascus that was made actually and discursively by sultans and scholars respectively. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana. So our last paper is by Mayssoun Sukarieh. She is a senior lecturer in Middle East Studies at King's College London. Her research interests focus on youth, education, development, and social movements in the Arab region, with a particular interest in studying the political, economic, cultural, and social structures and processes that tie the region in complex and contradictory ways to the larger global political economy. Her first book, Youth Rising, The Politics of Youth in the Global Economy, co-authored with Stuart Tannock, was published in 2015 by Routledge. She was a visiting professor here at CAMES for 2 years in 2009, and she was a close ally and conspirator with of Tarif's. She unfortunately cannot be with us today, but she sent her paper, and Dr. Ali Al-Khalidi will be reading it. تفضلي عليا.
So I'm going to be speaking as if I'm Mayssoun, but don't, mix up. In the beginning, it was cumin. A history of food in a northern Biqa village, Mayssoun, Sukarieh. When I was asked to take part in this symposium to celebrate Tarif, I felt totally out of place. I am no historian and no Islamic studies specialist, just a friend of Tarif and family. I knew Tarif loved Baalbek, and he thought he was an expert on Baalbeki accent. He would ask about the koshk, khobz, jabr, as they say in Baalbek. My answer would always be, Aslan, we do not say khobz or koshk, we say kishk or khobz. He would insist this is how they say it in Baalbek. But I would say, I'm from Fakha, not from Baalbek, and we say it midway between Baalbeki, khobz, koshk, and Beiruti way, khibez u kishik, ya mama. Since it was a war of words, at the end I would draw his attention to the fact that at least we make our own kishk and khubz. And what exactly have you to do with them except consuming them and making fun of the villagers who make them? I thought of speaking about food that Tarif is a great fan of, through the history of kitchens in my village, and that this might gain me a place in this symposium. So in this talk, I will trace the food chain in a northern Biqa village, Fakha, from the 1950s to the invasion of the satellite TV food programs in the 1990s. Through an oral history conducted with 10 women in the village, representing different generations and classes of local residents. The paper will show how different dishes were introduced to the village, analyzing the infrastructure and actors that helped to evolve the process. What is the history of the kitchen in the village? How did women learn new dishes? What products were introduced at what time? Who introduced them? How did that affect women's roles and social relations in the village? Fakha is a small village of 8,000 inhabitants in the Biqa Valley, whose houses are distributed across 3 areas: Zaytoun, Jdeidat al-Fakha, and Fakha. It is not a touristic or rich village. Like many villages, it has 3 main big families and some smaller ones. Since it's not touristic nor rich in any natural resources, the Fakha people are mostly bureaucrats employed by the state and well-educated, as education has been the means for climbing up the social ladder. In 2015, Fakha was the village with the most educated population in the whole of Biqa, and up there with the most educated villages in Lebanon. As its men left the village to study, whether in Syria, Beirut, or elsewhere, this meant that the village men tended to marry women wherever they ended up studying. The village was divided historically by class based on ownership of land. Not a huge ownership, it's true, but nevertheless differences did exist amongst landowners. Later on, money was made from professional jobs as well as some other form of Lebanese ways of making money, not drugs though. Being an administrative center in the Ottoman period and open to the north, Homs in particular, made the village open to new dishes, unlike neighboring villages in the northern Biqa. My presentation, Mayssoun's presentation, will be divided into 4 parts. The first part will cover the process of dish addition to the kitchen. The second will deal with the rise of canned food. The third with garbage. And the fourth will end with with television as the main source of learning new dishes. There's a short and tentative conclusion. So, on widening the scope of dishes in the village, I quote, No one knows how to make the traditional dishes anymore. Everyone wants to make sushi mushi, fajita mahita. What's wrong with wara anab? It's even better than sushi. This was my aunt's comment when one of her daughters-in-law sent a picture of a sushi plate she was serving on New Year's Eve in 2017. For my aunt, this was a sign of deterioration of, I quote, women who try to be different, who do not want to identify with the village and its food, who want to prove they are mitmadneen or modern without adding anything to society or their families. She continues, how many things have changed through time? Who said that the village stores will have all the spices and ingredients for food from all over the world? God bless those days when Abu Habib, the first grocery store in the village, used to bring a few items from Homs. We made everything from scratch, from the spices to the burghul to the kishk. Says another lady in the village, and I quote, now you go to the grocery store where there's a huge rack with all sorts of spices, but what bothers me most is the curry. The smell comes out in your sweat and it kills all other tastes in the dish. No one keeps provisions anymore. They even buy the kishk and burghul by the kilo. But how can they trust the producer? A third woman intervened. Yeah, khayti, Ya khayti, they need to say they cook with curry mitmadneen, modern ya khayti. Yet another woman responds, and the mitmadneen do not stock provisions, muni, they only consume. The quotations above reflect not only the generational conflict over the kitchen, but also a class struggle and a struggle between modernity, i.e. making a non-Middle Eastern kitchen on the one hand, and tradition on the other, i.e. making the traditional food of the region. In addition, this conflict relates to class and social status as displayed in the Fakha kitchen. To tell the story of the kitchen, the three women opted to start with spices. As one of them says, because they're fed up with the curry and the masala. Recounting the history of spices a century back reveals not only the widening of dishes in the village, but also the move from the local production of spices to their consumption, and with it to the consumption of food. Apparently, at the turn of the century, the only available spice in the village market was cumin. I quote, cumin was added to all dishes back then, kibbe, fasulia, and everything with meat. When black pepper seed coming from Homs was introduced to the village market, the women started making their own khalta, or mix. The khalta is usually made of, and I quote, whatever is available in the garden and the peppercorn that the only grocery store got from Homs. What was available to be used as, unquote, what was available to be used as spices? I quote, each woman had her own khalta. Mine was the peppercorn crushed with roses, warjuri, some basil, haba, and some marjoram, mardakush. This was my mother's mix, while others used only basil and roses as they could not buy the peppercorn, and others still just used peppercorn, unquote. She assured me, it depends on the woman's taste, not the men. When a woman gets married, she insisted, and I quote, she will need to change the taste of her husband to accept her food. How true. She added, and I quote, we experimented a lot, like the time when cinnamon sticks arrived in the village. Those who could not afford them added them to the mix. But not everyone likes cinnamon, as it has a strong taste. Up until the 50s, the only spices present in the store were cumin, pepper, and cinnamon. Cinnamon was not considered a spice and was mostly used for tea. People liked its sweet taste, as there was no sugar up until then. In the 60s, unquote. In the 60s, they started to get the 7 spices that are a mix, and this caused a revolution in the kitchen. And the 7 spices were used for everything. Then people went back to making their own mixes of spices that started to come in bags and were already ground. The choice of spices were gradually growing larger with new dishes introduced to the village. But, and I quote, "It wasn't until the last decade that one got the spices from all over the world, because it used to be mostly spices we use in the Shami kitchen, as our capital was Homs. And this was the case even up to the 60s and after the creation of the nation state." Unquote. The development of the kitchen in the village was slow, yet more diverse than neighboring villages. Women disagree as to the reason for this. My aunt argues, and I quote, "As Fekha was a governorate center in the Ottoman Empire, it was open to other centers in Syria, and the villagers learned much from that. When the French arrived, and under the French mandate, the center shifted to Ras Baalbek, but the French brought in shit with them. They do not even have a kitchen, so the Ras Baalbek kitchen stayed very limited." Unquote. Nevertheless, they all agree that it was intermarriage with Syrian villages and towns and other cities in Lebanon which most affected the kitchen. For a while, and I quote, "Villagers ate what they produced in the village itself," unquote. Vegetables and grains mostly, and not much meat. Burghul, grains, and kishk, or koshk, according to Tarif, were the main winter kitchen dishes, while in summer it was mostly vegetables grown in the village. At first, it was the extended family cooking together, but yet each eating alone. So they would cook together, but each house or nucleus. There is a story women tell when they want to emphasize the idea that if you love a person, you find their cooking delicious. Apparently, 2 sisters cooked together and divided the dish between the 2 families. One of the children ate at his aunt's house and then went to eat at his mom's and swore to her that his aunt's dishes tasted much better. Quote, "May you bury your parents, tu'bar ahlak. We made it together and simply divided our share." He would insist and swear to her that his aunt's dish is much more delicious and that she had better learn from her. So basically, بحب خالته الولد يعني. The villagers planted eggplants, zucchini, green beans, tomatoes, and cucumbers. Winter vegetables were cabbage, chard, potatoes, spinach, and krum, or better known today as kale. The village was known for its krum, and it used to be stuffed. In winter, they got all the dried vegetables from the summer. I quote, "We dried everything: tomatoes, zucchini, eggplants, dried grape leaves, all of which were added to the winter vegetables and grains consumed in winter. We had no lemon trees, and our lemony dishes were made either from pomegranate molasses, sumac, mostly grown in the arid areas above the village, or the sour grapes, husrum, juice. Luckily, tabbouleh was not in our kitchen, so there was no need for lemon." Unquote. In the absence of rice in the village, yakhni dishes were made with burghul, fasulia, chicken, green beans, but the kitchen consisted mostly of sautéed vegetables. I quote, "Everything can be sautéed with a bit of samni baladi and onion. Garlic to be tasty, of course. It was tasty because it was all homemade. The burghul, the kishk, the vegetables from the land. Kibbi bikishk was served every Friday in winter, and in summer it was kibbi bilabani. And whatever is left the next day can be cooked with kishk in the morning. Meat was for occasions when you slaughter from your own herds, a lamb, a sheep, or a chicken. And whatever is left is made into awarma for the winter." Unquote. This was for those who could afford it. But how did you stuff everything if you did not eat much meat? Mayssoun asked. She answered, quote, why do you need meat to stuff things once you have burghul and homemade samni baladi? If you stuff it with anything, it will taste better than meat. Hummus, burghul, and samni baladi, the taste is still under my teeth. I can feel it. Unquote. Rice entered the village in the 30s. Weddings consisted of burghul mansaf topped with a slaughtered animal. When rice entered the village, they sprinkled the last layer of the burghul with rice as if it was pine nuts. The consumption of rice, however, did not pick up until the 70s. In the 60s, it was more for invitations and meat once a week. At first, they used it as a medicine. I quote, whoever is sick will have boiled rice for all sorts of illnesses, from headaches to stomach aches to colds, unquote. The village kitchen got more diversified with women coming from different places. In the 50s, there were two major introductions to the village. One was through immigrants coming back from Latin America, Argentina, and Brazil. I quote, we have a very special dish for you, my grandfather told us. When we arrived at the end of the village by bus, I imagined it would be like kibbe or some other nice dish. We arrived at the house and we found boiled spaghetti. It had just arrived at the village from Homs. I wanted to cry. I had 3 months of spaghetti on the Italian ship that brought us from Argentina. But my mom looked at us with that look. We understood that we had to eat and be grateful. So, unquote. Spaghetti arrived in Fekha in 1953, but they used it to boil it and eat it. Like rice, whenever a new dish entered the village, it was enjoyed by the very few and it would just be boiled. It is, I quote, new, and the new does not need any spices or samni baladi or anything. It is special simply because it's new, unquote. It was only later on that my mother taught them how to make spaghetti sauce with or without meat. From Argentina, dishes like guiso, I don't know if I pronounced it right, guiso or guiso, rice, peas, meat, carrots cooked with herbs, spices, and tomato sauce, different eggplant dishes, stuffed peppers, as well as different kinds of pies and meat steaks were introduced to the village. From Argentina, also using thyme, za'atar, as a spice was brought in, as well as the first time that they put raisins in food, raisins in empanadas or in stuffed peppers. From Argentina, too, the vegetable stew with maize was introduced. In the late 50s, a young man from the village went to study medicine in Damascus and married a Damascene girl who used to come and visit her in-laws all summer with her sisters and brothers. And from Damascus, the ablama, sheikh al-mahshi, fuliye, and many other dishes with rice were introduced to the village. At first, they'd teach the hostess, then the hostess would cook them during feasts and invitations and teach other women in the village. From Damascus, all sorts of fattis were introduced. Fattit hummus, fattit batinjan. The Damascenes introduced coriander as a necessary herb for many stews, including fasulia, bami, and some harra usba'u, as well as sitti zmi'i. Not quite sure whether anyone has heard of sitti zmi'i. While zmi'i. Okay, لأنه there was a ayn and not a two in transliteration. While coriander was introduced by the Damascenes, the Aleppo chili was introduced when an engineer went to study in Aleppo and brought it back to the village in the late 40s. It took a while for people to get used to the hot taste, but it has become a must in some houses. From then on, with men from the village marrying women from different cities, the women would introduce certain dishes with them. This was the case when the village dentist married a Ba'al-Baki from the Rifa'i family, who taught her relatives the uzi. So rice is not anymore just boiled, and the sfiha Ba'al-Baki made from scratch at home. Dishes were also introduced with women from the village moving to different parts of Lebanon with their men serving in the army, such as the kibbi ras from Zgharta and other dishes. In the 60s and 70s, when the Soviet Union was offering scholarships, many went to study there and got married to Russian women. However, nothing from their food became part of the village kitchen, as I quote, they have only the borscht and no one liked it. Cabbage is best when it is stuffed, not in the soup, unquote. Syrian refugees in the village introduced a few dishes, mainly related to how to preserve the provision of goat cheese and other small dishes. In some homes, Indonesian maids brought in some nasi goreng dishes with them, or they brought in dishes they learned from their work in Saudi Arabia, like the kapsi, or the variations of how to cook Shami dishes, such as the zucchini with lemon instead of tomatoes, or making rice beside the labani when making kibbi labani instead of cooking it inside the laban. The second section is the army and canned food. With the rise of the nation state and the creation of the armed forces, further changes to the village kitchen were introduced. Many men from the village joined the ranks of the army and were posted to different cities and villages in Lebanon. Most of the time, wives moved to live where their husbands were serving, which meant, I quote, the wives learning new dishes and adding to the village menu, unquote. Through this, people talk about food introduced from the north, kibbi zghartawiye, sfiha zghartawiye, and pastries from Tripoli. Most importantly, the contact of the villagers with the coast meant, and I quote here an army wife, the introduction of many fish dishes, sayyadiye, marinated samak, kibbit samak, fried samak with the tahini sauce, all were introduced through the wives of armed forces, people who served either on the northern or southern coasts of Lebanon, unquote. But the biggest change with the army was the introduction of canned food. I quote, before canned sardines and canned cheese were introduced by the army, the first time the concept of canned food was introduced to the village was in the 30s with the British or French armies. One of the armed forces came back with a tin of dried milk, and his mother thought it was corn flour. She made it into a dough and went to the tannoor to make cornbread. When she stuck it in the tannoor, it all fell apart. She came back cursing the corn flour of the Brits to learn from her son that it was milk. Canned milk? According to the story, it was even more of a surprise to get dried milk. I quote, what does that mean? We know how to dry tomatoes, zucchini, green peas, even meat. But milk, may they bury their parents. How did they make it dry? Unquote. The British Army also introduced canned beans, and I quote, that no one liked because it was sugary, unquote. However, canned food as a concept began to be introduced to the village with the Lebanese army. First, as they consumed it and told the villagers what they ate when they were serving. But then by bringing canned tuna, sardines, cheese back to their homes with them. Moreover, teachers and other bureaucrats started to go to Baalbek to receive their salaries, and they began to bring back canned food with them, mostly halawi, tahini, sardines, and tuna fish. Eating canned food was not highly appreciated at first, and it was considered food for the poor. I quote, I'm not sure how it got to be a sign of modernity, of women who take pride that they do not cook, just open cans and that's it. Unquote. In the 60s, two retired army men opened grocery stores in the village, and canned food slowly started to creep into the village at large. canned sharab, canned tuna, and mostly canned samni, al-baqra al-halub, olive oil, as well as vegetable oil, while rice, of course, and sugar became abundant. The introduction of canned food to the village was limited at first to the bureaucrats who, I quote, can't afford to have annual provisions, unquote. Those who could afford it refused the idea of the can as being, quote, unhealthy, insufficient, and unnecessary, unquote. Provision in the village, however, widened to include mainly big bags of rice and sugar, which were saved, and I quote, like burghul, beans, lentils, and kishk in the big tin containers in the provision rooms, muni. These big bags, unquote, these big bags at first used to be bought in from Baalbek as there were no wholesalers in the village. I quote, families who could not afford the provisions just brought them by the kilo from the grocery store in the village, unquote. The canned food available was slowly getting wider to include tomato paste, then chickpeas, then ready-made hummus, then fool. I quote, the wider the selection of canned food was getting, the smaller the provisions got. And we reached a time when there was no longer any space for provisions in the new modern houses. No one made tomato paste anymore, and no one cared to make chickpea provisions. Then the selection widened to include lentil and many other items, unquote. So the third section is the rise of garbage. Up until the 80s, most of the village had no garbage to dispose of. Everything was recycled. I quote, there was a function for everything. Take, for example, burghul. You make the burghul, and the wheat crust that comes out, ruwaishi, will be used to make pillows. There's nothing to throw in the garbage. Also, the flour of the wheat is turned into a dish called abu amni that you bake with onions and rumman in the tannoor, unquote. There was a function for everything. Quote, you peel rumman and make the rumman, and the pomegranate peel will be used either as medicine, its powder is very good for stomach aches, or use it for coloring the wool in the production of rugs in the village, or even dried to be burned in winter, unquote. Another quote, tell me something and I will tell you how we never got rid of anything. Take the inedible fruits from the village, all of which was turned into vinegar. All vegetables are dried if they are very ripe and exceed their use, and all the vegetables and organic leftovers were thrown back to the soil or given to whoever has herds and chicken. Everything was reused one way or another, unquote. Apparently, when canned food was first introduced to the village, everything was reused. The small tins were used to keep herbs, dried mint, dried basil, salt, and now the many kinds of spices, while the big tins were used to plant either herbs or flowers before the whole idea of flower pots was introduced to the village, or to hold provisions or other grains and food. With the shift from canned food as substitute for the provisions and the growth of the village population, this became unsustainable. I quote, with modernity, people stopped raising herds or chicken in their backyards, so the leftover food was to be dispensed of as garbage. Also, with the presence of 2 vegetable stores beside the grocery stores, you get the plastic bags as well as the cans. It was hard to recycle everything. In the 80s, people used to take their garbage and dispose of it in the flood channel. Sa'i flood channel. In the 90s, and with the election of the first municipality, we got garbage containers all over the village, unquote. And the fourth section is the turn of the century, the television stations, and the second revolution of the village kitchen, consuming recipes consuming food. At the turn of the century, almost every house in the village had a satellite dish. There were very many food channels on the satellites that ran for 24 hours. Women started to learn from the channels how to make food, different foods. I quote, Mexican, Indian, Japanese, and there were even changes to our traditional food. Every house now has a scale and measuring cups and different sets of measuring spoons. Women follow the recipes of the TV chefs, word by word. Even salt is measured by grams now, unquote. The old women lament not only the fact that this is killing the traditional kitchen, but also killing the creativity of women. I quote, dishes used to be named after the women who cooked them best, or after the woman who introduced them to the village. Thus, for a while, the giso, since it was introduced by Shahina, used to be called the Shahina dish. After a decade, they started to call it simply giso. Likewise, because Shamma was well known for her tasty fawarigh, fawarigh used to be called after her, fawarigh Shamma. Now the dishes are called after the TV chef. Some man or woman we have never met or even know, like Aklet Manal or Aklet Chef Ramzi, and so on, unquote. Older women have a real distaste for the cups and scales in most kitchens now. I quote an older woman. The introduction of measurements and scales has also made women lose their touch with food. In the old days, we used to say someone نفسها طيب على الأكل. Or when someone cooks, they put their soul in the food. Yes, maybe our dishes were limited and we rotated dishes every week, but dishes tasted differently for each of us. It also reflected our mood in many ways. So sometimes you cook the dish and it turns out salty and you are angry, or it turns lemony and you are upset, and so on. It was a way to tell your husband you are angry with him, or you love him, or you had a bad day. Now, with all the measurements, it is all the same. Angry, happy, or upset, it tastes the same. And it is not your soul. It is some chef from the satellite and his soul in the food. There are no messages through cooking to husbands, mother-in-law, or children anymore. My aunt says, unquote, my aunt says, my daughters-in-law cook like robots. It is mechanical. They bring in the scales and the cups for all the dishes, and not just for cakes. And they just measure, add, and get the dish. They do not even adjust the measurement to the products they are using. For example, if you sometimes use canned tomatoes of different types, you need to adjust to get a taste. But no, it is like Quranic verses. You memorize and repeat mechanically, no questioning, no messing around. Another woman says, consuming recipes is one form of consumption of food and dishes. Another woman complained, another kind of consumption is the rise of delivery food. Delivery, unquote. The recent presence of Syrian refugees in the village, with 14,000 settled in the village from Homs province, not only helped the rise of restaurants, whether for breakfast, fatti, hummus, fool, or lunch, mainly Halabi kitchen, but also for the coming for the first time of the concept of home delivery of food to the village. I quote, excuse me. So I'm quoting, the presence of many Syrian workers besides the rise of consumption amongst mostly non-working women has led to the proliferation of restaurants as well as the delivery culture, unquote. The village now has 8 restaurants and 5 bakeries and 1 major restaurant that is specialized in social events, weddings, invitations, engagement parties, and there are many Syrian children working in delivery. Besides the obvious rise of a culture of consumption, the women who are against the delivery culture are against it because, and I quote, "They think it kills many relations in the family. It kills," I quote, "conversations in the morning on what to cook for lunch or dinner, and it kills conversation whether the dish was good or not, how and why it is salty or lemony. Then I can talk about my salty lemony day." Another woman says, "It kills the relationship of mothers to their children. Children always remember the taste of their mother's food, and we say this bonds them together." Another says, "It kills a sense of creativity and production by women, and a weapon they can use to starve their men when they are not happy," unquote. And a final quote, "It kills the race to attain distinction among women as to who is a better cook. It kills their empowerment as well," unquote. So this finally comes to the conclusion. What do we learn from this local history of food in one village? One, I would say, we learn how recent some of the changes in food practices are across 2 or 3 generations, or even in a single lifetime, across a decade or 2, and how these different food practices are still coexisting in this one village. The second conclusion would be, it is a story of creativity, innovation, and empowerment. The way in which, on the one hand, you have an increasing variety of food practices, but on the other, a loss of innovation, creativity, and empowerment. 3, stories exist here of sustainability, both in terms of sourcing food and disposing of food waste, and a real situation concerning a shift towards less sustainable practices. Then there is the rise of consumerism and increasing dependency on markets and the corporate production of food. And 4, there is also a longer history of linkages between food practices and migration patterns, from practices of marriage to refugee displacement. And 5, again, we encounter here the gender dynamics of using food, the power of women as the cooks in the house, food as social activity. And finally, we confront food as a marker of social and class distinction and status, and how this has shifted across time. Thank you. Can I say one thing? I wish I had written this paper, actually.
Performance high.
Thank you, Ali. Thank you to Mayssoun. Thank you to our 3 wonderful speakers, wonderful papers. The floor is now open for questions.
صباح الخير. بداية مريم أشكرك على المداخلة الرائعة، اللغة السلسة والتوضيح واختصار السند. فقط أردت أن أضيف أن بالنسبة إلى قطام، نسب عائلتها مختلف فيه قليلا، فأحيانا يقولون قطام أو قطامة أو قطامي، بنت الشجنة أو بنت الأخضر أو ولكن ما أثار انتباهي هو قطام الكلمة نفسها. فالقطم هو شهوة اللحم أو الضراب أو النكاح. فإذا دلالية اختيار الاسم، ربما قطام لم تكن موجودة ولم يكن اسمها قطام من الأساس، ولكن اختار المؤرخ الأول هذا الاسم، وأيضا هذا الصوت قطمة، يقطم اللحم أو يقطم الشيء. فهي لم تكن مجرد المرأة التي تبغي زوجا يحقق لها مهرها، ولكنها كانت أيضا الشهوة، شهوة الانتقام، شهوة اللحم أو النكاح. فقط هذا ما أردت قوله. شكرا لك.
بالنسبة لدلالة الاسم، هو الاسم مختلف في تحريكه. يعني قطامي هذا الوزن المستعمل لأسامي الإناث للاسم المؤنث، هناك اختلاف في إذا كان ممكن يعني في بنائه على الكسر أو إنه ممكن لا يكون مرفوع منصوب. بس يعني الرأي الأشهر إنه بنائه على الكسر اللي هو قطامي. هو يعني الوزن مستعمل فقط لأسماء الإناث، يعني وهو جاي يعني معدول عن قطمة، القطعة من قطع. حكيت أنا شوي بالبيبر عن دلالة الاسم بس ما قلت اليوم. أوكي. بس هو طبعا يعني فعل القطع يعني it echoes، هي يعني اسمها على دورة على كل شيء منه.
Thank you for a really wonderful, wonderful panel. I want to echo the question before, because I was actually thinking the same thing. She sounds to me to be an archetypal figure. And then I was also thinking about your paper, Dana, and thinking about, again, this kind of conjunction of, if you like, space, time, and biography to produce an archetypal image, whether it's a space, whether it's a person, or so on. And of course, we know that no matter how you theorize the archetype, whether you want to do it psychoanalytically, whether you want to do it literarily or whatever, it always embodies a kind of an ethical dimension, which in your case was very clear in your paper. But I want to ask you, Dana, to maybe bring that out a bit, especially because of the Fada'il genre, having this very strong, what I understand, at least from the few that I've looked at, Fada'il al-Habasha, masalan, have a strong kind of ethical dimension. So there's a forging of the self that is also happening, both in the walks, in the process of encountering the spaces, in the process of even collapsing, if you like, a universal history with a contemporary kind of topographical situation. Do you see what I'm trying to say? And the embodiment of biographies all the time. Ethical hina, I mean in terms of forging of the self. A kind of a way in which being and knowing and existing fold into one. A way of experiencing the world, if you like. Do you see what I'm trying to say? Like, you're pulling out a certain discourse, right? And in that discourse, there are moral elements that are coming up all the time. But I wonder if there's more that can be done with that. Maybe it's too vague, my question.
That is too vague. I need to understand a little bit more, and I think there's not much more that can be done with that, right?
Yeah.
So maybe it's too early or too fresh from. Yeah, I need to think about it.
Okay. It's a thought, because there's a very clear link for me in my head, which
We'll talk about it.
Okay.
Yeah, at this point, I really can't answer the question.
Okay, because I come from a theater background, I'm very interested, maybe we'll talk later, but if you need to think about it, because both in the Ashura tradition, so my understanding is that there are no female figures replaying the Ashura event or the 10 أيام or مقتل الحسين or. So that's something I wanted to know whether you came across while reading. And the second is for you, Dana, about the whether coming to the Adira also included attending some kind of performances that were kind of also available, or what kind of rituals, was that available? Did they mention any kind of rituals that they used to attend? And because it's been so banned from Islam to يعني, do performative rituals. So I'm just wondering, they did see all of this in the Adjira, يعني, so.
إذا بتعرفي بجديد بلشوا يعملوا غير مجالس العزل اللي هي كلاسيكال، يعملوا مسرحيات و they do the whole part. وبهالمسرحيات بيكون في نساء، بس بيكون يعني مثلا إذا عم يحكوا، إذا البلاير هي مثلا زينب، بيكون حاطين على وجهها as if no, you don't have to personalize it. لا مسرحية عادة، يعني بيكون كيف بيعملوها بالعادة بالضيق. ايه بالنسبة لي يعني مسرحة النصوص ما مرق علي هيك، بس بحس انه هيدا يعني اذا بدك اكزامبل كتير قوي على كيف النص كتير عملي. يعني النصوص اللي خاصة بحادثة كربلاء قد ايه عندها براكتيكال هيدا هلا، مش بس بالتعزية وبالمجالس يعني إذا بناخد example يمكن يكون شوي controversial، بس إنه إذا بنفكر بالشباب اللبناني اللي طلع على سوريا تحت سلوغان لبيك يا زينب، فهيدا جاي من باك جراوند اللي هو تكست قد ايه هو فاعل فيه، قد ايه هو كتير براكتيكال بالنسبة له.
So not only are there performances in the sense that they're processions that they describe, and the production of flowers by the boys is a big part of this ritual, of the rituals that they describe in these things. But in one of the cases, I don't know which Abbasid caliph, he took his Sammajun with him. And I looked, I didn't know, I'm like, Baraf Simaj, but I didn't know where Sammajun, and so it turns out they were actors actually. And so there was a lot of performance in this, and a lot of inversions and very picaresque stuff going on.
So essentially I have some comments and some questions, but I'll start with Aliya's point. In South Asia, there are certain rituals that focus on the woman's role in the whole massacre of Hussein. So what the women did, and I know some actors and women singers who play those roles, and those trace back in time. But if you read the whole play, as a play, is the story as a play, you see that there are women who play roles in the whole massacre. You know, what they say when they are encountered with the corpse, beheaded, and all of this. So the initial narrator saw a point for a woman to play a role in that event. And I think Islamic history is misjudged on the issue of theater. We don't have the records. And we judge on the basis of the lack of record, and it goes back to a discussion I had with Tarif yesterday that the oral tradition is often bracketed out by historians. We don't account as an evidence of the presence of something, so we only look for written sources. So we have been very prejudiced toward the writing, and for the most part, theater doesn't exist. But the Hakawati, for instance, which traces its back, this is a form of play yeah, Khayal al-Zil. You know, all of these were part of a very active kind of theater that existed in the Muslim world. Mariam, thank you. It's a fascinating paper. I don't have any questions to ask, but I just want to note that. Then I have two comments. One little bit corrective, very minor point. Usually, Hafiz, today we automatically think of Hafiz al-Quran, and we translate it as Quran memorizer. in pre-modern times, Hafiz indicated hadith, memorizer of hadith.
I know this.
Yeah.
I copied exactly where it's like.
Yeah. This is a very common mistake, by the way. Yeah, and we judge it on the basis of the day. And because the forte was the Quran was a small text in comparison to the hadith. That's why hadith was always, to earn a memorizer, you need to memorize double the Quran or 10 times the Quran.
So in my published paper about, there's a whole section about al-Hafiz.
Yeah.
That means,
So that's great. Then I'll take back that. And that actually ties me to my broader comment. Ibn Asakir was really known as Hafiz al-Sham, and that's by the acknowledgement of his peers and his successors. There was no one like him in Syria. Yeah? So his memorization of hadith and isnads and hadith scholarship, which is a critique, seemed to them unparalleled. At the same time, and precisely given what you just told us, he had a soft spot for weak hadith, because only the weak hadith would allow him to web this sanctity of Damascus and its influence, right? And they noted it as well, is that even though he was al-Hafiz, that unequaled, he used to handle these very questionable stuff. Yeah. So in that spirit, my comment actually is broader, in the sense that what you shared with us, which is fascinating, is this process of I wouldn't, yes, Islamization, Sunnification to some extent, because Ibn Asakir was very aware of that aspect. Of trying to take a heritage and try to give it, I wouldn't call it exclusively Islamic, but a very markable Islamic, and that left a trace. So what would help us also in this process of investigation is to see were there voices against that process. And look and behold, we don't have to search hard, because the lunatic Ibn Taymiyyah stands up to demonizes this process as it is going on. And you find the traces of that everywhere of his writings, is this process of the Muslims, Sunnis in particular, venerating these questionable spots.
Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya.
And obviously, he starts a lineage in that way, is that because it's unfolding in their own times and taking this kind of popularization, they are standing. So it's important to look at both sides of this, how it is being played out. Is this the establishment of Damascus as a sacred space, and the counter argument that these spots are all associations with heresy, with false Islam, and all of these things.
So the beauty of this whole thing, of course, this is all written in the paper. But the beauty of all of this is that both Ibn Qayyim grave and Ibn Taymiyyah's grave became sites of visitation, and they show up in al-Hawrani. So these are the people who were very much against it. These two were very much against this whole cult of shrine visitations. And they attacked it vociferously on the basis that it was actually, especially Ibn Taymiyyah, that it is it's copying Christians, and it's kind of brought in by insincere Christians who converted to Islam. So it was really based on the Christianity of the activity that he goes against it. And then lo and behold, their graves become visitation sites, and that's kind of how this ends, really. So yes, it's a part of the bigger story. Thank you.
Was there a question?
For both Mariam and Dana, I'm going to start. Is this clear? Mm-hmm. Okay, very quickly. I'm going to come to you in a second, but I want to ask Dana a question first. And this is about liminal space, right? So if a diyarat is liminal space, right, what happens in the Islamizations in the ziyarat? right? What is there alternate? Does this mausoleum become a liminal space? What kind of liminal space is that, and what happens there, and so on and so forth, right? And do you want to answer that question?
No, I can wait.
Mariam, okay, and Mariam's and there's something like similar between the two of you, which is the question of al-hawa, dhamm al-hawa, Ibn al-Jawzi. All right, and I want to come back to you, right, the question because of this intersection between anecdotes, khabar, sha'r, qasida, and the role of women, al-hubb, al-ishq, right, in sort of the sort of unraveling of political assassination plots and so on and so forth. But I want to ask you more precisely about the role of al-hawa, right, in this kind of narratives, right, or particularly Kayd al-Nisa that you find in both story and history, and in Tabari itself, in the story of Sulaiman, right? There's a story about Jarada, right? Because of whom? Because she worships her father, right? Sulaiman loses his power for 40 days, right? And loses his ring and so on and so forth. You know about that story. But and this comes back to the function, right, of these stories in historical narratives. And I think this brings us back to the question Dalia raised about the difference between politics and ethics, right? Is there a difference between the two?
So again, I didn't have time, and even in the paper, so Victor Turner has a whole book about pilgrimage as a liminoid phenomenon, whether it is the space, which is also outside the city, or the activity, because once you enter, you are out of the usual social order to enter a different space. So I kind of, pilgrimage is so much more obviously liminal, at least in the scholarship, so I didn't take time to talk about it. So it's a very different kind, and maybe it does need some work. But then also there's a part of me that is like, really? Am I using Victor Turner right now? So I think I do need to, I depended on Victor Turner, that he has a whole book about it and just say liminality. But maybe I need to actually show how the two are different kinds of liminality.
Can I say something about what sort of like the qubba among the Chinese Muslims and in Central Asia? Right, in later period, right, these become places of performance of ishq, right, and qalandars, and what they do is they come, right, they recite poetry in praise of Muhammad, but usually come out in the form of poetry, right, and also these are these qubba, which is the sort of the tombs of the ulama and Sufi saints, right, they become like madaris, like places of learning, and libraries where Muslims come and sort of so there's a lot of sort of like pilgrimage in a sense, but it's also رحلة في طلب العلم, but also performance of identity, religion's communal identity, something like that. It would be interesting.
No, I mean I need to sit with it just to bring out the differences.
I'm reluctant to say that we are dealing with like the same motif, the motif of زوجة سليمان اللي من وراها خسر الملك ومعروف لأن like we have two levels of narrations. That of Sulaiman is like it's in the context of قصص الأنبياء, whereas that of Qatami and Ibn Muljam it's like in the تاريخ يعني الماضي التاريخي اللي محفور المسند. I don't see that there's like ممكن إنه يعني شيء بنفكر فيه بس بحس إنه we have two different levels.